On the 10th day of Israel's continued assault on Gaza, and in spite of mounting international protests, Israeli ground troops pushed deeper into Gaza. The death toll has risen to 531 Palestinians and 5 Israelis. Nearly 2,500 Palestinians have been wounded since the bombing began last week. 49 Israeli soldiers have been wounded since the ground invasion began on Saturday. Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak vowed Monday Israel will press on.
Hamas has so far sustained a very heavy blow from us. We have yet to achieve our objective, and therefore the operation continues. The fundamental objective of this operation is to have changed the reality of security for the South.
Israeli ground troops have reportedly surrounded Gaza City and divided the Strip into two, cutting off internal supply lines. Amidst reports of house raids in some areas, air and naval raids have continued on other parts of the Gaza Strip. Among those killed were a family of 7 from the Shati refugee camp and at least 4 Palestinian paramedics. On the diplomatic front, the Security Council is meeting again today to discuss the crisis after Sunday's emergency session did not produce a ceasefire resolution. On Saturday, the United States blocked a UN Security Council statement calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Egypt, meanwhile, is hosting meetings for a European-backed ceasefire today. Egyptian Foreign Minister Ahmed Aboul Gheit emphasized the importance of Security Council action.
Why hasn't the Security Council acted when it is necessary that it act? The issue is, I think, it will take some time, but the matter also requires increasing the pressure directed at reaching a Security Council resolution. It is not possible that the matter remains this way.
Israeli officials claim the military operation is not targeting civilians and that there's no humanitarian crisis. Israeli President Shimon Peres said Sunday, quote, "There's no shortage of basic needs in Gaza." He was interviewed on ABC's This Week by George Stephanopoulos.
Even today, by the way, one of the passages is open because there is no shortage of basic needs in Gaza. We take care that medical equipment and food and fuel will arrive to Gaza, even today.
Israeli Foreign Minister Tzipi Livni told humanitarian organizations Sunday Israel wants to, quote, "ease the life of the population during the military operation."
Military operation in Gaza Strip made a clear distinction between the fight against terrorism and between the need to help the population. In a way, we opened the crossings more than ever in comparison to the past in order to bridge all the gaps that were there in terms of humanitarian needs. In an understanding that the military operation is something that can be perceived or can affect the daily lives of the citizens. We want to work together with organizations in order to see how to ease the life of the population while there is an ongoing operation against Hamas.
Despite Israeli statements, fears of a humanitarian crisis are growing. The United Nations Food Program has reportedly suspended operations in northern Gaza, where nearly 250,000 people are without electricity. Reports indicate nearly 70% of the 1.5 million residents of Gaza are now without water. Hospitals are struggling to cope with the rising casualties and running on fuel-powered generators, even as fuel supplies threaten to run out. I'm joined now by Christopher Gunnis, the spokesperson for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency known as UNRWA. He's on the line with us from Gaza. Welcome to Democracy Now! Can you describe the situation there, Christopher Gunnis?
It's absolutely horrifying. The people of Gaza are terrorized, they're traumatized, and they are trapped. On the humanitarian front, 1 million people across the Strip are without electricity because we've been unable to get fuel in, though we did get some fuel in today, to the main power plant that's been shut down since Sunday. At least 250,000 people, probably more, are without running water. Our food distribution centers have all but 2 of them managed to keep going, and all but 5 of our 18 health clinics have opened. But when I hear Israeli politicians say that there is no humanitarian crisis. There are plenty of supplies in Gaza. Israel's obligations as an occupying power do not end when they dump a handful of trucks on the edges of the fence that they've built around Gaza. We have to have a humanitarian, strategic breathing space around certain facilities so that we can get goods in at the sufficient quantities, namely the Nahal Oz crossing point for industrial-level fuel, and if we can't get that in, then these 1 million people without electricity will continue to be without electricity, and we need to get in grain, wheat grain, at the main conveyor belt at the Karni crossing, an industrial-sized crossing. Without that, our food stocks will run out in the next 48 hours, and people, particularly those cut-off communities around the fighting in northern Gaza, face the serious threat of hunger. There is a humanitarian crisis, and it ill behoves Israeli politicians simply to say there is no shortage of anything in Gaza. There is a shortage of wheat and there is a shortage of fuel, and that means that people are facing a humanitarian crisis.
We're also joined in Washington, D.C. by Megan Buren. She's senior advisor to the Israel Project, which is a pro-Israel government group in Washington, D.C., also based in Jerusalem. Megan Buren, when you hear Christopher Gunnis's description, it's very different from what the Israeli leaders are saying.
First, let me be clear that we're a non-governmental organization. And I hear what he's saying, and I think that there are very difficult situations on the ground in Gaza, without question. But you see that there are very difficult situations on the ground inside of Israel as well. And where was this outcry of support when 9,000 rockets were being fired at Israeli civilians in kindergartens and living rooms and bedrooms? People have been sleeping in bomb shelters for years, living their lives in 15-second increments, wondering whether or not they're going to have time to get to a bomb shelter in the next 15 seconds when the siren goes off. When is it enough?
Christopher Gunnis, your response to the situation in Israel?
First of all, we at the United Nations condemn the rockets, and let me again condemn them. They are utterly condemnable, and my message is as much to the rocket launchers as to the Israeli army, which is that enough innocent women and children, dozens, have been killed just within the last few days. And of course, our hearts go out to those families in Sderot, who, as your contributor from Washington says, are being terrorized. Of course, that is absolutely condemnable. However, let's look at the proportionality here. Let me ask your contributor from Washington, how many have been killed in the last few days? 531, among them women, children. Just last night, 7 of our refugees, unconfirmed reports saying killed in their beds while they slept. 9 of our students killed in one airstrike. This is not proportionate. And what is happening in Sderot, which is utterly condemnable, I don't think justifies this level of disproportionality. Anyone looking at the facts straightforward on the ground listens to what your contributor in Washington is saying and says, yes, of course, it's unforgivable, it's condemnable, but surely you can also understand that this degree of killing of innocent women and children and babies is not justified.
Megan Buren, your response.
And let me also agree that I think the death of a Palestinian child is no less of a tragedy than the death of an Israeli child. But for over 8 years now, we've been talking about rockets coming into Israel. Let's talk about that word proportionality for a moment. What should Israel do? We're talking about a democratic country that has a moral obligation, like any other country would, to defend its citizens. What would proportionality be? Every time Hamas fires a rocket discriminately targeting civilians, Israel should fire a rocket back, one rocket for one rocket, back into civilian territories? That would be awful. I mean, Israel tries very, very hard, and sometimes unsuccessfully, but tries very hard to avoid these civilian casualties. But Hamas continues to put their rocket launchers and missile launchers and activities in densely populated areas within Gaza. What should Israel do? What would America do if every day rockets were coming over our border, sometimes hundreds of rockets a day, specifically targeting innocent civilians? What would any country do in response to that after years and years? And also remember,
let's
Israel
put that question to Christopher Gunnis.
Well, let me say first of all that unlike your contributor, I suspect, in Washington, I spend a lot of time in Sderot. I go there all the time, and I speak to the residents of Sderot. And although at the moment there might be considerable support within Israel, in these frontline towns that take the barrage and are taking the barrage, by the way, which has intensified with this ground operation, they say, many of them say to me, the one thing that my government has not tried is talking. We talked to the PLO, and look, we got Oslo. Okay, there are many imperfections, and Oslo wasn't ever implemented. But you know what? A lot of Israelis say the one thing that's not been tried is talking, and you have to talk to your enemies. If anyone thinks that the misery and the grief and the tragedy that's being inflicted on the young generation, people seeing their grandparents and their children and their brothers and sisters killed in their droves, these are never going to be partners of peace. If anybody thinks that this is in the long-term interests of peace, it may short-term stop some rockets, I grant you that. If anyone thinks that this is in the long-term interest of granting Israeli citizens dignity and security, they better go to Gaza and talk to people about the sorts of feelings that are being stirred up by this wholly disproportionate use of force. The arguments being advanced by your contributor in Washington is pure short-termism. It feels vengeful, and it's not in the interests of peace.